Hi everybody, Rob here again. This is going to be a second attempt at this particular video because the first one was a silent movie, accidentally, and I'm going to try again. I'm continuing my series about D&D 5th edition, my thoughts on not just how it looks but how I expect the rule system will play. I have a little bit more experience having played with the full 5th edition rules for the first time a few nights ago, a session which I'll talk about in a later video. But first things first, our books arrived as expected. It's very good. Amazon.com came through a week early. Unfortunately the book is a bit damaged. You can't really see it here, but there's some quite severe scratching on the cover, and it's taken a few bludgeoning attacks to the corners, but that's something else and not to worry about for present purposes. In the last video I spoke about the flat character progression, the so-called bounded accuracy, and my views on that and how I expect that will affect the game. Continuing with the theme of major changes, the next thing I need to mention is the advantage and disadvantage mechanic. Now, if you've been involved in the playtest for the last year and a half or so, you will be aware of what advantage and disadvantage is. But if you're coming to 5th edition from previous editions of D&D or Pathfinder or any other role-playing game, you may not know. So, to give you a brief summary, if you have advantage, if a situation gives your character advantage, when you roll your 20-sided dice, you don't roll one, you roll two of them, preferably at the same time, but you don't have to, and you take the higher of the two rolls, and that becomes your roll. Likewise, if you have disadvantage, you roll two dice and you take the lower one, and that becomes your roll. So you can see it can make for quite a large swing either way. The beauty of this mechanic, and I do think it is a very smooth and very effective mechanic, is that it takes away the need for numerical bonuses. I personally have met several people who tell me they used to play D&D or other role-playing games, but they left the hobby because they felt it was a little bit too mathematical, and people who played it were a little bit too into the maths of the whole thing. You will note I say maths rather than math. I make no apologies for that. The point is, this mechanic takes away a lot of the numerical bonuses, and those bonuses sometimes became a law unto themselves, working out whether certain bonuses stacked with each other, the addition and subtraction of the bonuses and penalties kind of detracted from the game. It increased the distance between the actual play and the immersive experience, so it made the mechanic more dissociated, to use the term that's often bandied about. Advantage is much better. It's smooth, it's quick, and it's applied in various situations. Many of those are hard-coded into the rules. So for example, if you get knocked prone, or if your character is knocked prone, attacks made against you with melee weapons will get advantage. So the attacker will roll 2d20s instead of 1, and the highest one will count. In certain circumstances, being prone will give attackers who are trying to hit you with missile weapons disadvantage because of your prone position. So many of the situations are built into the rules, those situations that give you advantage and disadvantage. But in addition to that, Dungeon Masters are now encouraged to assess situations and to determine whether any given situation gives you advantage. So there's a discretionary element to it. Dungeon Masters can decide, well, because of what you've done before, because of the situation, I'm giving you advantage on your next roll, and then you will follow the advantage rules. And likewise, your situation is compromised in some way and you therefore have disadvantage. And I mean, that's a good element. I mean, Dungeon Masters should have that discretion and should be able to affect those in the same way they could have given you a bonus in previous versions, or a penalty. Advantage ties into another new element in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and this is called inspiration. Now Dungeon Masters are encouraged to reward characters, when players exhibit certain role-playing finesse or panache, or just generally play their characters well, if that happens, and it's generally tied to certain things called backgrounds, which I'm going to talk about in a later video, but essentially you may choose a series of backgrounds which are really role-playing aids. And I must say I was a bit skeptical when I saw them first, because I thought they might help a beginner player who's never rolled up a character, but for an experienced player with an ongoing character, perhaps not. I've changed my view. I think they're excellent tools to get you into your character, to find little hooks. So with a background, your character will come with certain flaws, bonds, personality traits, etc. And by playing to these flaws, bonds, and personality traits, you will make it possible for the Dungeon Master to reward you. They reward you by saying you now have inspiration, which means essentially you have advantage. And you can use that advantage on a d20 roll of your choice in the future. You decide when you want to use it, and you can also give your advantage to one of the other characters in your group. If they, in a situation of dire need, for example, need to make a saving throw against some other terrible effect, you can actually hand your advantage, the inspiration, to them. This happened in our recent game. My character was awarded advantage simply for a role-playing element which involved playing towards the certain background bond that I had. The Dungeon Master recognized, immediately gave me advantage, or gave me inspiration, which in turn gave me advantage, which I used. I was initially skeptical of the mechanic, and I still am to some extent, of all mechanics that are rewards given in-game for role-playing, because I think they are so subjective that it can sometimes cause a bit of disharmony, and can also result in a situation where players become a bit mercenary about invoking their traits and personality flaws and bonds, etc. And it becomes a little false, the whole situation. So, I mean, I'm still withholding judgment, but my initial skepticism certainly seems to be wrong. I think it may well work, but I think once again it's a mechanic that will depend to a large extent on your group, and how mercenary they are in their approach to Dungeon Master awards. Obviously, inspiration runs parallel to experience points. It's an entirely different reward system, and it doesn't affect or detract from the amount of experience points you may receive in any given situation. Okay, so that's advantage and disadvantage. Very good mechanic. Changes the game for the good, in my view. Speeds up play, smooths it out, and also I find doesn't dissociate you from the mechanic too much, in that most of the situations which give you advantage or disadvantage are plausible. It's not a situation where you feel it's just been arbitrarily tacked on. So, for example, in 4th edition, where every character class had some or other daily or encounter power which gave you a +2 bonus to your attack roll, and all of them just had this different fluff text, but ultimately all it was a +2. It was difficult to believe in. This mechanic is not difficult to believe in, and it's one that I think will set this version apart from others. That's advantage and disadvantage. The next thing I want to talk about when it comes to significant changes is this pertains to the spell system. Spell system remains the same, so-called Vancian spellcasting system, named after Jack Vance's novel, or a particular Jack Vance novel which describes spellcasting in a certain way. The system is more or less the same, except now, rather than have a certain number of spells of a certain number of levels available to a spellcasting character, you have spell slots. A spell slot is, if you want to think of it figuratively, is really just a container for spells. So, for example, if I'm a second level sorcerer, I may have 2 first level spell slots. Please don't quote me on that. I don't know if that's accurate. I will, feel free to consult that for the actual numbers. But for example, if I have 2 first level spell slots, it essentially means I'm able to cast 2 spells over the course of that day, and they must be first level. But at higher spell slots, say for example I have a 4th level spell slot, that means I can use that spell slot to cast a 4th level spell if I have one. but I can also use it to cast a 3rd level spell or a 2nd level spell or even a 1st level spell. Now you may ask, well, why would I do that? Well, you do that because the spells have become more flexible. So just to give you an example, everybody knows Magic Missile. Magic Missile in 5th edition is 3 missiles that you shoot out from your hands which don't miss the target, and each missile does 1d4 plus 1 damage. It's the standard Magic Missile that people used to fight about back in 1st edition days, and still probably will fight about, but be that as it may, it's a 1st level spell. But with this system, with the spell slot system, I can use a higher level spell slot than level 1 to cast this spell, and if I do that, I power up the spell. So for every level higher than 1 that I use, the spell slot of a level higher than 1 that I use, I get another d4 plus 1 missile added to my Magic Missile spell. So you can see where this goes. Theoretically, if I had the ability to cast 9th level spells and had a 9th level spell slot, I could cast my Magic Missile as a 9th level spell. That would effectively mean that I would have 12d4 plus 1, so 12d4 plus 12 damage from my Magic Missile. Of course, I'd have to be probably a 17th level wizard to be able to cast that, but that gives you an example of how spell slots work. Almost every spell is now powered. You can now power it up at a higher level, which is great flexibility wise. It also means that spells don't have to be left behind. So if you've got a favorite spell, you don't need to jettison it when you get to 4th level because it's no use to you anymore. Now it develops with you and your level, and that is a great addition. Just from a flavor point of view, forget the mechanics. I don't think it's gone far enough. I think we've seen a lot of role-playing games in the last few years which have shown that the D&D spell casting paradigm can be extended even further and can be made more interesting. And I think, for example, of Dungeon Crawl Classics, DCC. If you've ever played it, if you haven't played it, check it out. It's fantastic. DCC is a slightly more random, slightly more gonzo take on old school Dungeons and Dragons. And it may not be your taste, but I think most people who enjoy D&D would like it. But what what DCC does is it personalizes the spells even further. So for each spell you need to roll a dice, and the result on that dice plus modifiers determines how powerful a spell you create. Low rolls can result in disastrous consequences for you and even for your companions. The notion being that magic is dangerous and unpredictable. Now, magic is dangerous and unpredictable are fantasy tropes to my mind. They're flavors that I always want to put into my games, and it's something that I felt D&D has not really kept up with. Perhaps these spell slots and powering up spells is a step in the right direction. DCC takes it further. Another aspect that I would love to see incorporated in the 5th edition spellcasting system, which is not in at the moment, but who knows, we've been told the system is going to be modular, so let's reserve comment until I've seen the Dungeon Master's Guide or any further modular content that may come. What Dungeon Crawl Classics has is this idea that each spellcaster will have a slightly different version of the same spell. So my Magic Missile will not be your Magic Missile, at least not identical. And it does it by way of a table known as a Mercurial Magic table. Mercurial Magic is simply a D100 table you roll on whenever you get a new spell, and that gives a special effect, a special property that's associated only with your version of that particular spell. And I think that's a great addition, personalizing spells in that way, and I hope we'll see something along those lines in future for 5th edition. Spell slots, more flexibility, great casting. In fact, just as a side note, what I do notice in this version, having now read the Player's Handbook, or at least most of it, is there's definitely a greater emphasis on the existing spells and tying those spells into to many classes and many situations and making them more useful, getting more mileage out of the spellcasting system, and not having it as, in previous editions we've seen 2/3 of the Player's Handbook made up of spells and only 1/6 of the characters actually having any reference to those spells. So there's definitely there's a drive to make the spells more relevant and more useful. That's spell slots. The third thing, and it's the thing with which I'm the most concerned, and I am still not entirely convinced of, is the question of resting in 5th edition. If you played 4th edition, you may know of the concepts of long and short rests. If you haven't, essentially in this version, a long rest is the typical rest at the end of a day's adventuring that we've seen from the earliest versions of Dungeons and Dragons. In 5th edition, when you have a long rest, you recover all your hit points, you get all your spells back, all the powers sorry to use 4th edition language, but all the abilities you may have which last for the day are then all recovered at the end of a long rest. It's fairly uncontroversial. More controversial to my mind is the notion of a short rest. Now this is tied to hit dice. Hit dice in 5th edition have a different meaning to hit dice in previous versions of the game. Hit dice are still measured the same way. In other words, if I'm a 5th level fighter, I have 5d10 as my hit dice. But hit dice are used to self-heal, and they are used to self-heal during what's known as a short rest. Now a short rest must be at least 1 hour, and during that time I can spend as many of my existing hit dice by throwing the dice and adding that amount to my hit points. It's self-recovery, and I've got a certain number. So if I'm 5th level, I'll have 5. Let's say I have 5d10. I can roll 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 up to 5 if I want to recover that many hit points, and then carry on with the rest of the day. I don't recover those until the long rest. When I have a long rest, all my hit dice are returned to me, and I can use them in the course of the next day. Now what this means, of course, is that characters have a massive amount of self-healing open to them. When you couple that with other healing options, which I'll talk about in later videos, possessed through magic healing, stabilizing injured characters, etc., it becomes very difficult, I think, for characters to die. Now, people have taken me to task already and said, oh, but hang on, my 1st level monk got 3 crits against him immediately, and he died, and doesn't that means it's fine. Well, if you get 3 crits against you in a row, I mean, on most systems you're going to die. That means not only are you cursed, but that the gods of chance have marked you for the rest of your days. And so I mean, that's a statistical outlier. I'm talking about the normal run-of-the-mill gaming session. My concern is that it's not deadly enough, and I'm worried about a trend which seems to have been growing since 3rd edition, which is to try and wrap player characters in cotton wool and prevent them from getting too badly mauled. I understand you want a continuing campaign. It's difficult if you keep killing the characters. TPKs ruin any thread you have in the campaign, story arc, etc. That I'm fully aware of that. But what concerns me is that when campaigns are not deadly, and when they're not perceived to be deadly by the players, it changes the way the players approach the game. One aspect is the geography. I think that essential element of Dungeons and Dragons is a buy-in into geographical matters by the players. And what I mean by that is the players must be invested in the geography of the area that they're adventuring in. The classic example being an underground dungeon crawl. It's important that the players invest in the map and want to draw a map. What I'm finding as the editions have increased and gone on is my players, and certainly in the group I play, and these are experienced players, they've been playing for many years, some of them since 1st edition and earlier, they tend to lose interest in mapping. And the reason that they lose interest in mapping, in my view, is that mapping is no longer as important, because dungeons are not as deadly, because rule systems are not as deadly. And that means players know, with all this effort to balance encounters with party strength that's gone into this version and previous versions, players are aware of that balance, and they know that ultimately they're probably going to be able to beat every monster. They may suffer, there may be resource management issues along the way, but they know that if they simply follow the turn left at every turn principle, they will get through the entire dungeon and will eventually come out on top. So I have players who've given up running away as an option. They've given up mapping to a large extent, because you're only really interested in whether you should take path A, path B, or path C in a labyrinth if you know that one of those paths has a monster that you cannot beat and is likely to kill you, because then it becomes real as to whether you take these options. If it's not a real and genuine threat of death, people lose interest, I suspect. They still enjoy the game, but there isn't the investment that there should be. Unless your party knows that running away is an option, well, they haven't faced hard enough enemies, in my view. And my worry with 5th edition, and it's not just this edition, is that it becomes incredibly difficult. And certainly to injure and kill characters to the point where they start to play differently. And that's really what you want. You want there to be a genuine sense that I could die, or my character could die. Hopefully the players will be fine. I'm one of 3 dungeon masters in our group. All of us have run games in the last 2 years, and we all had the same sort of view that this party of characters made up of players who are experienced, who are really experiencing the synergy between their character classes and are good at appreciating those synergies, becomes harder and harder and harder to do them real damage as they advance in levels. Even if you're scaling the enemies up, and I mean, it got to ridiculous proportions in 4th edition where I was doubling the damage output. I think I played the module Pyramid of Shadows. I ran it. At one point I was doubling the damage output of every creature and upping their hit points, and my party still sailed through without a single death throughout that entire dungeon. And that's telling, I think. I worry that 5th edition will continue that trend, and that will affect negatively the way players play the game and the way they become immersed in the game. I'd love to hear your views. If you think I'm talking out of my hat, let me know. Put a comment down below here. If you agree with anything I've said, please do the same. Or if you've managed to read through this amazing book, and it is, in my view, amazing, and promises a fairly amazing game, give me your views. Let me know what you think. Otherwise, see you next time.